それでは
Ladies and gentlemen, it's exactly 2 o'clock, so we'd like to start the symposium. We'd like to thank you very much for coming to our symposium entitled How Climate Action in Japan Can Lead the World with Christiana Figueres, a former Executive Secretary of UNFCCC. I'll be serving as a moderator. My name is Ken Tanaka from WWF. Before the start of the program, several housekeeping announcements. We have given you a white sheet of paper in addition to the program today. This is for jotting down questions during the panel discussion, questions to the panelists. When you have written down questions, our staff will be coming around to collect them during break in the middle of the program. And we have put on your seats receivers for simultaneous interpreting. You will probably be using them in the latter part of the program, so please hold on to them until the very end. We'd like to start the symposium. Last year in December at COP24, the Paris Agreement rulebook was adopted. In order to achieve the goals provided for by the Paris Agreement and toward implementation in 2020, we need to drastically strengthen climate change countermeasures here in Japan. At the symposium today, we have with us Ms. Christiana Figueres, who made a tremendous contribution as Executive Secretary of UNFCCC at COP21 when the Paris Agreement was adopted. We'll be discussing approaches necessary in Japan and long-term strategies which we should draw up for implementation of these approaches. So first, we'd like to invite from CDP Japan Director, Ms. Morisawa. Ms. Michiyo Morisawa, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. One of the Secretariat of JCI is CDP, and I'm Morisawa from CDP. With Ms. Christiana Figueres, we are to organize this JCI symposium. It was in December of 2015 that Paris Agreement was adopted. As Mr. Tanaka mentioned, this Paris Agreement is a result of the hard work made by Ms. Christiana Figueres. This agreement aims to keep global temperature rises below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, and it also pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. It's an international framework on climate change since the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. After an interval of 18 years, this is the first such an agreement participated by 196 countries. And it also puts down global warming countermeasures beyond 2020. This is an agreement between governments, so government measures are important. And companies will be impacted by global measures as well as Japanese countermeasures. And as for global trends surrounding this long-term strategy, we will hear from Professor Takamura about this. Ms. Figueres was actively working towards the industry and especially to investors who are investing in these businesses. She was talking about the importance of climate change countermeasures. It is important that investment methods should urge companies to reduce such emissions, and she was calling on companies to become a member to change the market structure. This became the trigger for everyone to understand the importance of these measures. Approval by investors and with the understanding of the industry, countries will be able to set their national determined contributions. We will hear from Mr. Mizuno from GPIF about the importance of the activities of the investors. There is going to be a transition in energy policy. There is going to be a transition from coal as well as from oil to renewable energy. Japan who needed to depend on fossil fuels. After the oil crisis, energy conservation progressed, and it was able to accomplish economic growth by producing goods that were highly efficient in terms of energy consumption. Now we have to go decarbon. We need a top-runner policy for this measure. With a higher demand for renewable energy, there's going to be jobs to be created in the regions, and there's also a chance to foster industry. On the other hand, business managers, especially those managers of businesses that will be negatively impacted by this move, they must understand this change and develop strategy. That will be important. For a just transition, there has to be social dialogue between stakeholders. It is essential to have engagement from investors. You also need to involve labor unions in this dialogue, because large corporates' strategy will have an impact on their business partners. SMEs would also need to understand and take action. So countermeasures against climate change and for a just transition, in the panel discussion session later on, we will have a discussion by investors, businesses, local governments, as well as non-governmental actors. JCI exchanges views with various stakeholders in Japan, and we are determined to become a bridge between the world and Japan. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morisawa. We'd like to now start with the program. We have keynote speeches at the outset. We have Ms. Figueres, Christiana Figueres, who was former Executive Secretary of UNFCCC and Vice Chair of the Global Covenant of Mayors and Convener of Mission 2020. Ms. Figueres was chosen as an inductee of the Kyoto Earth Hall of Fame, which is presented to those who have made tremendous contributions to the Earth's environment, the preservation thereof. And she came to Japan to receive the award, which was presented on the 9th of February in Kyoto. We'd like to extend our heartfelt congratulations to you, Ms. Figueres. Ms. Figueres will be talking about the decarbonization revolution and the expectation for Japan demanded by the Paris Agreement. Ms. Figueres, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon to all of you. I apologize that I shall have to speak in English. It is wonderful to see you here. As has already been announced, my colleague Andrew Hyam and myself are in Japan with a couple of agendas. The first was to visit Kyoto once again, having been there for the negotiations of 1997 for the Kyoto Protocol, and pay our respect and honor for that first legally binding instrument under the United Nations Climate Change Convention, which so many people worked so hard for, and where the government of Japan and also the city of Kyoto were so helpful and so influential in reaching that. So first of all, our respect, our honor, and our gratitude to the government of Japan and the city of Kyoto for having given the world the great gift of the Kyoto Protocol. We were also happy to be in that same ceremony to draw the relationship between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, because the fact is, without the Kyoto Protocol and the root lessons that we derived from the Kyoto Protocol, it would have been very difficult for the world to adopt the Paris Agreement. And the image that I use to convey this idea is you're getting ready for the coming of spring, and you're all looking forward to the cherry blossoms. You will enjoy, as does the rest of the world, walking in between those beautiful trees when they bloom. But when we appreciate those beautiful flowers, we tend to forget that all of those flowers are there because of the roots. And so the Paris Agreement, in similar fashion, that everyone is talking about now, is here and has been adopted because of the root lessons of the Kyoto Protocol. So again, a huge thank you to Japan for its leadership in those days, the late 1990s. And our second agenda point of being here in Japan is to support the leadership of the public sector in Japan and the private sector in Japan to continue a leadership that is very much wanted on the part of Japan. I don't know if you realize how the world continues to look to Japan for leadership, certainly on climate change issues, because of the Kyoto Protocol, but also because of your technological leadership in so many different areas. So that is the reason of our trip to Japan. And today, I would like to share with you a couple of thoughts that hopefully will conclude us by realizing that the decarbonization of the global economy is by now not an experiment. It's not a good idea. It is not an inspiration of some. The decarbonization of the global economy is by now unstoppable. It is the one direction in which the global economy is moving, and it is frankly irreversible. It is not going to change direction. It's like a river. The river will continue to flow in one direction no matter how many stones are among the waters of the river continues to flow. And so despite the current political position of some national governments, the fact is the global decarbonization of the global economy continues to flow forward and in fact is getting to the point of being exponential. So let me give you a couple of points of why I believe that this is so, and I would like to argue it by sharing with you what I call the 5 big imperatives of decarbonization. The first imperative that I would like to bring to your attention is the moral imperative. The moral imperative is given to us in many different ways, but perhaps most eloquently and in a most compelling fashion by the latest science report that was put out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the report on 1.5 degrees. From that report, we learn that if we allow the world to go to a 2 degrees temperature rise, as opposed to keeping it to 1.5, the 2 degrees temperature rise would give us 2 to 3 times as many people threatened by death because of hunger or lack of water. It would give us 2 to 3 times as many people forced out of their homeland because they cannot survive there or because they have been driven away by extreme weather events. That, of course, puts a lot of pressure on migration toward other countries, and most of that migration pressure will be in Asia. So that is a moral imperative that we have to understand, and that we will have to admit that when everyone, including Japan, adopted the Paris Agreement in 2015, we didn't have that scientific certainty, but now we do. And hence, although there is a range of temperatures included in the Paris Agreement, somewhere between 1.5 and well below 2 degrees, the fact is that we must all change the GPS of global economy and head now for 1.5 and no longer for 2 degrees, because the moral imperative dictates that we, as the responsible adults on this planet right now, make sure that we are headed in the right direction and make sure that our decisions today will not have huge economic and, in fact, existential consequences on our future generations. Japan is no exception to this, since already last year, without having to wait for more natural disasters, already last year, I don't have to remind you that Japan suffered the loss of over 200 lives in the floods and over 1,500 lives because of heat strokes. Just a small example of where we are headed, and you will all know that the Olympics being planned for 2020 will have to start early in the morning. At 5 in the morning, the marathon will start, or the walking, and then the marathon will start at 6 because of the heat that is expected here in Tokyo. So, enough said on the moral imperative. I don't think I need to give you any more data. I think we all, as responsible human beings and as responsible adults, know that it is our moral responsibility to ensure that we are not headed for disaster either today or tomorrow. The second imperative that I would like to share with you, and please understand that all of these imperatives actually stack up one on top of the other. They're not mutually exclusive. All of these imperatives actually are mutually reinforcing. And therefore, that is why decarbonization is unstoppable at this point. So the second imperative that I would like to share with you today, let me call it the technological trend imperative, which is, where is energy technology moving today? You will hopefully know, and if you don't, I'm happy to update you, that today already 25% of all of the electricity that is on the global grids, it's not in one country or another, just complete, all of the electricity grids of this planet, 25% of the electricity flowing through those grids is already renewable energy. You will also want to know that just last year already, 2/3 of all of the new electricity that was put online, the new capacity, 2/3 of it was renewable energy. Only 1/3 came from the family of fossil fuels around the world. You would also might be interested to know that even in the United States, the U.S. Patent Office, that is the one that receives the request for privately owned patents in technologies that are being developed, has consistently over the past few years received 10 times as many patent requests for new technologies and innovations that have to do with renewable energy, 10 times as many as those that have to do with fossil fuel technologies. So with all of those data points, I think that I have made my point that the technological trend in the energy field is incontrovertibly toward renewable energies, the whole family of them, and no longer a trend toward the fossil fuels, who we should thank, certainly thank all the fossil fuels, that they gave us the kind of development that industrialized countries are enjoying now. But from my perspective, being already 62 years old, and some people are already beginning to thank me, I hope that people thank me and retire me very quickly. Because we older people deserve to be thanked and put into retirement. The same thing with fossil fuels. We should thank them for the work that they have done. There's no question that we would not be where we are without the support of fossil fuels, but it is time to thank them and retire them and move forward into the new family of energy technologies of the 21st century. So that is the second imperative, which is the technological trend. The third imperative, that is mutually stacking and reinforcing the movement toward decarbonizing the global economy, is the increased awareness of financial risk that is embedded in high carbon, certainly in coal first, but then also in oil and gas. And that financial risk is one that has been growing. The awareness of the financial risk is one that has been growing over the past, I would say, 5 to 7 years, very helped by the Task Force of Financial Risk Disclosure that has moved now to every country of the world, including Japan, where companies and financial institutions are being asked to assess for themselves the financial risk that they have, to which they are exposed because of their portfolio, because of their products. And as a result of this disclosure and as a result of the growing awareness of the financial risk, in particular of coal, we have a long list that I'm told is now 3 pages long, a long list of financial institutions of all sorts that have actually already taken the decision to no longer finance coal. And those institutions include HSBC, they include CalPERS, they include certainly the World Bank. That was the first development bank to move out of coal, and just 2 or 3 months ago, they retired the funding from the last new coal plant that they had planned to finance, but that they have moved away from. It includes PNB Paribas, all of the other regional development banks, Bank of America moving in that direction, and it includes, interestingly enough, insurance companies that are doing a double hit. They are, with their financial arm, retiring their investments certainly from coal, but also from their from their insurance arm, actually beginning to refuse to sell insurance premiums to the coal industry. And those include Allianz, AXA, Zurich Insurance, and many others. So I'm just giving you a few of these financial institutions, private, public banks, regional banks, development banks, insurance companies, reinsurance companies, all of whom have decided that it's actually too risky to keep their capital in coal because it is an asset that is devaluing quite quickly. At the same time, you have a growing list of investors of all types who have decided that they're actually going to very actively increase their investment in the family of green technologies and clean energies. For the same reason, because they are understanding the financial risk that they are incurring, and because there are report after report after report that is coming out that is showing that those companies that actually have not just climate, but the sustainable development goals at their core strategy, not on the last page of their annual report, but those that have the SDGs as their core strategy, those companies are substantially outperforming in the financial markets, those companies that are not. And in fact, add to that, those are the companies that are attracting the best talent of our young people who do not want to work anymore for companies that are irresponsible. So, financial risk and financial opportunity, both trends and imperatives that are now quite well set and that are not going to change direction. The fourth imperative that I wanted to share with you is what I would call the social license imperative. And what I mean by the social license is the ongoing movement of people in rural areas, certainly in urban areas, that no longer want to compromise their health. These are people who actually want to breathe clean air. And all of you will have read the reports of the demonstrations in China. You will have read the reports of air quality in India. And it is taking hold in more and more countries and certainly in cities because people simply do not want to have bad air quality. In Delhi today, somebody who was born and lives in Delhi statistically has 6 years less to live than anyone born in any other city in the world. That is not fair. And that is because of air pollution. So from a social license point of view, fossil fuels in general, coal, because the burning of coal for electricity produces not just CO2 for the global atmosphere, but also local particulates that are contributing to air quality problems, and the other fossil fuels, the liquid fossil fuels, because the burning of those fossil fuels in transportation are also causing local air particulate pollution that is contributing to poor air quality. So the entire family of fossil fuels is actually now under growing pressure from social license to operate, or rather the lack of social license to operate and a lot of pressure to close down coal plants, to move vehicles to electric, to clean electric technology. And you know how many coal plants have been closed in China, especially those around cities. You know how electric vehicles are actually moving quite certainly a little bit too slowly, I will admit, but they are moving into the market, and more cities are actually now regulating that new vehicles need to be electric vehicles. The first country that has regulated that is Norway. By next year, every single new car in Norway has to be electric. And then you have a whole list of cities that have regulated the same everywhere between 2020 and 2040. Independently of the year that each city has chosen, what is being sent to the market is the signal that that is the trend, that is the direction in which we are moving because of social pressure. So social license to operate being the fourth imperative. And the fifth and final imperative that I would like to bring to your attention is, frankly, the generational justice imperative. Should we continue as a planet to increase greenhouse gases as we have done in the past 2 years, and in fact in the past 150 years, we would way exceed the 2-degree maximum and certainly the 1.5 degrees. What that actually means is that our future generations will have to live in a world that is so unstable that it will be very difficult for them to have any predictability about their life whatsoever. In fact, we would move into a world that the insurance industry calls systemically uninsurable, because the degree of destruction will be such that the insurance companies cannot deal with the management of risk that would be brought upon them. So we frankly have no other option. This is not, well, do we want to do this or do we want to do something else? We frankly have no other option. When you look at all of these 5 imperatives and you understand that all of them actually stack up one on the other, that they are all mutually reinforcing, and that they all bring us not only toward less risk, but actually toward more opportunity. Because once the decarbonization takes place, and this is the story that can be told by companies, by countries that are already on the decarbonization path, what you see there is the opening up of opportunities. So a carbon constraint is actually a huge ingenuity opportunity. And that is true for every company, it is true for every city, it is true for any country. And that is where we need to move toward. And the latest global data that has come out of that global decarbonization is that if we are on track to decarbonize the global economy the way that we should, we will be creating 65 million new jobs. In a world in which everybody is concerned about jobs, it is actually a good thing to have 65 million new jobs. It would create at least $26 trillion in growth in GDP globally. And when you think that right now we may be at a point of economic slowdown and downturn, then the question really is this not the best economic opportunity that we have seen in a long time? Japan is not a country that is foreign to the impacts of world wars, and you know that at the end of every world war, or in fact at the end of any big war, the first thing that you have to do is invest aggressively in order to get the economy going again. At a moment of economic downturn globally, decarbonizing the economy is the best engine, the best economic engine that we could have as a mega development project to get our economy thriving again. So finally, my friends, with all of that seen from the global perspective, which is where I tend to spend my time on the global perspective, I think the rest of the conversation today has to be, so what does that mean for Japan? And so I look forward to the presentations that are coming after me. But I must say, from my small perspective, I think Japan has two choices, and only two. Number one, to lead, because Japan has everything that it takes. It has the natural resources. It has the capacity in its labor force. It has the technology. It has the capital to lead, and should be leading aggressively into a world of much more opportunity and much more stability. That is choice number one. Or choice number two is simply to be left behind. To be left behind and be controlled by technologies of last century that, as you know, I've already given you my opinion, should actually be in retirement or in the museum. So that's the choice. Does Japan want to lead, or does Japan want to be left behind? Given the speed of the decarbonization around the world, frankly, I don't think there is any in-between choice there for Japan, because decarbonization is not only happening, it is happening at exponential rates in many fields, not in all, but in many fields, and those fields where Japan could participate, definitely at an exponential rate. So I leave the question with you, my friends, and I know where you stand, but the invitation is for you to help everyone else in Japan, certainly the public sector, certainly the rest of the private sector, to make a quick choice. Do we lead, or are we left behind? I think everyone in this room knows that we would want Japan to lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Figueres. We have to move on with decarbonization. There's no stopping, and we keenly felt that we need to think about what we need to do as a society through her speech. Thank you very much. So we'd like to now have keynote speech one. A member of the board and asset owner, Advisory Committee of Principles for Responsible Investment, PRI, Executive Managing Director and CIO, Government Pension Investment Fund. Mr. Mizuno will be talking about how Japan can be the ESG-developed country towards a major power of decarbonization business. Over to you, sir, Mr. Mizuno. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mizuno.
Speech, and I think the Japan need to hear a lot of the enthusiastic voices who want us to be a leader in this field. 本日はですね、このような会にお招きいただきまして、
I'd like to thank you very much for your invitation today. I would like to especially thank the organizers. I'm a GPIF CIO. And other than that, I am a board member of PRI. And Michael Bloomberg recently, on entrustment from the World Bank, set up the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative. I'm one of the 8 founding members. And Prime Minister Abe is chairing Paris Agreement, a long strategy roundtable, and I'm a part of this as well. So today I'll be talking about Japan as an ESG leader for the decarbonized society, sometimes as a GPIF CIO, I may say something which does not fit my present capacity, which has been explained. So, but please think of all of my positions and capacities when I do something, when I do say something that doesn't seem to fit the description given today. Since 4 or 5 years ago, as a management philosophy, I have been stressing the need for ESG. GPIF is an ultra long-term investor, and in addition to that, it's a universal order owner having a large part of the world market. So beating the market or beating the competition, that's usually the finance or asset management business model, but we need to look beyond that. We need to think about how to make the system sustainable. And I believe that we need to concentrate our efforts there. And a most readily understandable approach is ESG investment, and we have been leveraging this parameter. And as Christiana has mentioned earlier, fairness between generations is now a concept which is penetrating. GPIF investment is such that a lot of in the older generation feel that it's their own money that they've saved up, but the Japanese pension system is such that the present generation is paying for the future generation. The future recipients of pension money are being funded by the present younger generation. So it's ensuring fairness across generations, which is one function of our pension system. Stepping aside from the investment of GPIF, let me talk about climate change. In the 6 months or so, Prime Minister Abe has been very positive in his statements, and in 2019, on the 4th of June, about the Future Strategy Commission, about future investment, investing in the future for Japan. In this, he talked about global warming policies, which is not a cost anymore. It's the source of competitiveness. And companies which are positive about climate change countermeasures. And I talked about ESG. Money will be accumulated there, and further growth will be possible. And there'll be a virtuous cycle between environment and growth. And as several measures, he talked about not traditional regulations, but disclosures and making things visible to activate ESG is important. That is what the Prime Minister Abe said. And what I mentioned earlier, based on Paris Agreement, the long-term growth strategy, the expert roundtable was to be set up. And at the recent Davos speech given by Prime Minister Abe, I don't know how many listened to his speech, he talked about G20 this year. And there are a lot of discussion points for the G20, he said, but there are 2 points which he wished to single out. G20 global governance, and the second was innovation and the importance of innovation in dealing with climate change, and artificial photosynthesis, carbon capture, and hydrogen technology. This kind of new technology was pointed out. And to crystallize all of this science in Japan, and to collect all of this in Japan, and making disclosures visible, and collecting ESG money. And METI has launched a TCFD research group, and a guidance from this group came out on the 25th of December 2018. And Prime Minister Abe made reference to all of these. And Christiana has talked about how she had high expectations of Japanese leadership. But the leaders in Japan are saying things that show their willingness to take leadership. And I'm very happy that this is the case. Deviating a bit from the thrust of my talk, I often say that Japan has developed a national brand in terms of manufacturing, it's not because Japanese government sold Japan's manufacturing capacity. Toyota and Panasonic, these large manufacturers, went to the United States and Europe and sold high-quality goods, and that led to brand recognition. So individual companies' efforts became a national brand. But in the flow of decarbonization, unfortunately, lack of strategy on the part of central government has led to a declining of the Japanese corporate brand. And GPIF is the largest stock market owner of the Japanese market, and we feel that it is a pity that this is happening. National branding is very important, and we want to take the leadership with regard to climate change from this perspective as well. Back to ESG, green finance and ESG. Concerning these words, I am consciously ambiguous when I use these terms because people have different definitions. In Europe, the difference in definition is giving rise to confusion. Taxonomy, similar yardstick or definition is what they're trying to create. I am not denying this effort, but sometimes it's better to be ambiguous, and that happens. ESG, in particular, when ESG was started 4 years ago, when I talked about climate change, it was very difficult for me to talk about climate change on the part of GPIF. Because people would question whether GPIF is trying to force Japanese companies to do something about climate change. We used to be accused of this in the past, but thinking about the long-term risk of companies and tying this in with ESG, the largest issue within ESG is climate change, and this consensus is now here, so it's easier for me to talk about it now. And I sometimes am consciously being ambiguous about the use of this term. I'm sure you're aware of what is happening in the world of ESG. In the past 5 years, the world investment in ESG has doubled approximately, and it's exceeded 2,000 trillion yen. Most probably 3,000 trillion yen is the actual impact. I believe this because when you say ESG investment, other than directly using ESG for investment, there are different methods of ESG investment. So if we include that, I believe that the impact would be greater. And Japan, it was said to be lagging behind, but we're picking up speed very quickly. I'm going in reverse order, am I? This is my statement as expert roundtable committee member of the Paris Agreement. Japan wants to keep its position as an infrastructure exporter, and the Japanese government wants to focus more on infrastructure export. High quality infrastructure must have the sustainability concept embedded. And by embedding this concept, global infrastructure export can be promoted. And this is a major theme, I believe, for the G20 this year. I've repeatedly talked about TCFD. Last year, suddenly the TCFD concept gained momentum, and this is due to the Prime Minister Abe's statement in the Investment Council. I believe that the ESG risk, if GPIF wanted to announce this or evaluate this, we invest through asset managers to our investees. If asset managers do not disclose, we cannot roll up the figures, and asset managers cannot obtain the data unless investees provide the information. So the sustainability climate risk disclosure should be such that it should permeate all. And there are different frameworks in the world, and people are struggling with it. TCFD started with the G20, so it's a major flow, which is gaining momentum here in Japan. Mark Kearney, Bank of England governor, said that he was so surprised at the rapid increase in momentum of TCFD. And rather than financial institutions, it was businesses that were signing up to this. And climate change disclosures are such that it cannot be left up to financial institutions and investors. It has to be a bottom-up approach of this kind that is required for gaining momentum. And GPIF also expressed support for TCFD, and FSA as well as METI has also supported. So investors as well as institutions as well as government entities are supporting a TCFD, which is the basic concept for investment decisions. And GPIF's ESG approaches firstly related to direct engagement. And to start with direct engagement, GPIF is based on stewardship principles and investment principles. And to our investees, we talk to them about extended expansion of values or sustainability. And we tell them that ESG is an indispensable concept. And to the asset managers, we say that in investment, ESG factors should be considered. ESG integration is what people call it in the industry, I'm told, and we clearly request that this be considered. From the asset managers, the professionals, to their eyes, they need to look at the important ESG challenges, and they need to engage in dialogue with the investees. And GPIF asset managers are passive and active, and we asked them about what were the important ESG challenges, and these are the answers. There's domestic equity passive and overseas equities passive, and all of the asset managers said that with regard to climate change is of foremost importance, and domestic equities, active asset managers have board members. Maybe this is corporate governance frustration expressing itself here. Basically, ESG priority issues such that most of the asset managers said that climate change countermeasures was very important. And so we asked our asset managers to engage in constructive dialogue with the investees.
So engagement with companies, climate is the most global issue amongst ESG issues. So asking companies to participate in this global movement. In October of last year, Climate Action 100, that is 300 asset managers and investors came together. The most impactful companies, 100 companies that will have an impact on decarbonization. We will have collaborative engagement to have a discussion on decarbonization strategy. So we have become an official supporter to Climate Action 100. Of the 100 companies, Japanese companies, there are 10 Japanese companies on the list. And I think this is something that we should be proud of. That is because at this point, CO2 emissions becoming one of the 100 companies, which means that Japanese companies' products were needed by users around the world. So such companies are now proactively working on climate change strategy, which would mean that business world over will go into a virtuous cycle. So that is why we are taking part in this action. Now, carbon efficient index. This was announced recently. This was developed together with S&P and Topics, Japanese Equity and Foreign Equity Index. A number of new concepts have been introduced to develop these indices together. As we heard in the earlier speech, ESG and sustainable finance, one of the major trends is divestment. What this means is coal-fired plants, utilities will no longer be invested in. That is divestment, withdrawing investment into such companies. In ESG investing, this is now taken up as a major method, could be a mainstream. 4 years ago, when we talked about ESG, companies, businesses showed some allergic reaction. And one of the reasons why is ESG equals divestment. That was the association that people had. But at GPIF, policy of no divestment is what we say. What this means is that, well, I think there could be some discussion on this matter. What does it mean to divest? Ironically, let's say coal-fired plants, people who are aware of the problems, such shareholders, selling those shares to people who don't think of it as a problem. So what would be the effect of doing that is the question I have. But by divesting, you want to send a signal. So some investors want to send a signal. But as for GPIF, we have this policy of no divestment, and therefore we are not divesting. But in the place of that, we have engagement with businesses, and through such engagement, we try to develop and discuss decarbonization strategy. That is what we give, what we instruct asset managers. So our asset managers every year, whether they met our promise, their promise or not, would be one of the evaluation criteria. Now, carbon efficient index. This is direct investment into these companies rather than using divestment strategy. This is a major feature about this, that it doesn't use the divestment method. Through all industries, they have raison d'etre, but if they are providing the same service, the higher the carbon efficiency, we would overweight them, and we would underweight the companies with low carbon efficiency. That's how this index is created. A certain industrial sector, on an absolute level, there are certain sectors that have higher carbon footprint. Divestment is not an option that we take. We would invest, or we would overweight those with higher efficiency. So this is not divestment. By overweighting and underweighting in that industrial sector, we would like to urge them to have higher efficiency production. Another one is, well, there could be some misunderstanding here that global or greenhouse gases, the current status of information disclosure, SP Global, I think it was, that produced this data, GHG emissions disclosure rate. If you look at 15 developed countries, Japan, where does it stand? I don't know what the ranking is, but this is the red line, so it's lower than the middle. So below Japan are Hong Kong, South Korea, Thailand, Taiwan, and China. So obviously Japan should be above these countries and regions, but compared to European countries, or even compared against the US, disclosure rate is lower. So we need to make disclosure to make it visible, because investors cannot evaluate appropriately. When we talk about climate change issues with Japanese business persons, I always frustrated. It's not our frustration. This is the frustration of investee companies, because they say that they are working so much for higher efficiency and providing such products, but they are not evaluated properly by investors. That is the frustration. That is the dissatisfaction felt by Japanese businesses. In order to make such assertions to investors, they first need to disclose. So carbon efficient index that I talked about, for those companies that are active in their disclosure, first of all, they would get bonus points. That is how that index is designed. This is to urge companies to disclose. And within the same sector, if you have higher efficiency in your business model, well, that is the kind of model that people should be working toward in that particular sector. So when I talk about things like this, can you make a profit out of doing these things? That's the question asked at GPIF. Carbon efficient index. By using this index, over the short term, we don't intend to make profits. That's not our idea at all. As I said at the beginning, GPIF is ultra long-term universal investor and universal owner. So we're looking at long-term systemic risk. And if that risk is lowered, that will be the ultimate investment method that we employ. But we're professionals ourselves. So we don't say that return is irrelevant as long as the global environment is protected. So carbon efficient index, at the base there's topics. Compared to topics, statistically wise, risk return will be the same as topics. So if you look at this as a portfolio, risk return balance is almost the same as the broader index. This is the global case. Carbon efficiency. Improvements in carbon efficiency is 40%. Risk return being the same, you have higher efficiency by 40%. So that is the kind of portfolio that this index would be selecting. So in this fashion, at GPIF, as an ESG investor, we want to raise sustainability of the system as a whole, and climate change is a big theme here. How can we mitigate the risks here? We want to make a proactive contribution in this regard. And as we heard in the earlier presentation, there will be business opportunities. When will we have business opportunities? Well, that is when there is a major paradigm shift. I'm sure that all of you here are well aware of this and agree. Decarbonization, towards that direction, there's this major paradigm shift about to happen. For some people, this could be a risk. But for others, this could be an opportunity. The Prime Minister made that earlier comment. Whether you defend yourself looking at this as a risk, or you will go on the offense, looking at that as an opportunity. There was the question raised whether we want to be a leader or we want to be left behind. I would say we want to get on the offense side rather than being on the defense side. It's a question of whether you'll be on the offense or on the defense. At GPIF, in terms of portfolio risk, we want to defend ourselves, but we would like to urge companies, businesses, SDGs. These are goals of being on the offense side. You're aiming at those goals on a positive way. So I would like you to look at this as an opportunity to be on the offense in how to manage your business. And as a result, GPIF's performance will be raised so that future generations' burden of pensions will be lowered. So this would satisfy all fronts. This would be making everyone happy. So this would stabilize pension finances. And with that belief, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
水野様ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Mr. Mizuno. In Japan, ESG investment, the highest priority is climate change. And how that is being looked at, we have had a detailed explanation about that. So let us go to Keynote Speech 2, Global Trend Surrounding the Long-Term Strategy. Professor of Integrated Research System for Sustainability Science at the University of Tokyo Institutes for Advanced Study, Professor YukariTamura, please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. My name is Takamura, and thank you for this the invitation to this symposium on climate change initiatives.
Join the Mizuno-san to appreciate your wonderful presentation. Actually, your speeches cover, almost all elements of my speech, so that I am a little puzzled, but still, 随分素晴らしい。
But still, it was a very outstanding speech. The content of what she had said pretty much overlaps with what I intended to say. So I'm feeling a bit anxious. For my invitation, I'd like to express my gratitude. And I have been involved for a long term in climate change countermeasures dialogue. I'm very glad to be there for participating in this symposium with Christiana Figueres and also with Hiromichi Mizuno. I wanted to talk today about long-term strategies under Paris Agreement. I wanted to confirm that with you. And having done that, I'd like to talk about the following. Climate change and global warming countermeasures and strategies. What we'll have from now on will be drastically different. So I want to confirm the changes in the world that has taken place post the Paris Agreement. And I'm participating in the same roundtable as Mr. Mizuno. I learned a great deal at this roundtable. Long-term strategies, what the significance, what meaning does it have for us? This is a topic I'd like to discuss as well. The Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, I'm a legal expert, so I've put here a provision on Paris Agreement. Paying heed to Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, respective countries must formulate the long-term strategies and to submit it to the UNFCCC. The Paris Agreement, Article 2, the objectives, as written here, include the following. The target is to control temperature well below 2 degrees. That's a target with regard to the rise in temperature, which is included in Article 2. In 2016, at the Isashima Summit, at the COP21, it was decided that the submission would be done by 2020. But at 2016, the Isashima Summit, it was declared that the submission would come well before 2020, which was agreed by the heads of state. And in response to this, major industrialized countries submitted the 2050 targets as G7 member countries. Italy and Japan have not submitted long-term strategies. So that's how it stands at the moment. And perhaps there's no need for me to mention that last year and this year, since the start of the year, we've had unprecedented abnormal weather and changes in the weather. And this is familiar to all of you here in Japan. Torrential rains in western Japan, and September Typhoon 21, where the Kansai airport was immersed and submerged. And people said that maybe Godzilla walked over the airport. It was a huge damage done to the airport in the Kansai area as a result of typhoon in September. Nippon Keizai Shimbun, economic journal, announced that large 3 insurance, non-life insurance companies had paid out insurance money, which was unprecedented in relation to damage due to wind and rain. And Mr. Mori of the National Environment Research Institute said that climate change is increasing the frequency of abnormal weather or raising the level of disasters and abnormal weather. And worldwide, this trend is very marked. Here, Bank of England talked about climate change and what kind of activities they have engaged in. And this is a 2017 quarterly report, quarterly bulletin from 2017. And the yellow is economic damage amount, and it straight line upward. The purple is the damage for which insurance money is payable. And this has increased threefold in the last 30 years. And this is most important. Insurance payments is about 1/4 of the actual damage. It only covers for 1/4 of the actual damage. So the significance of the measures to be taken, and as has been warned, climate change negative impact hits the most vulnerable people and the vulnerable regions. And so in view of this, climate change issues, as mentioned by Christiana at the outset, this leads to social inequality and disparities. And this data actually is suggestive of that. And the interesting thing is that Bank of England compiles this data. IPCC's 1.5-degree special report came out last year in October. Yesterday, I was at Asia Development Bank's expert meeting headed by Dr. Nakao, and I was attending the meeting in Manila. And Hussein Lee is the chairman. And what was most interesting is that the IPCC's special report, how are we to interpret and receive this? That was a major discussion point there. And IPCC's special report, if you look at the content of this, compared to the Industrial Revolution, 1 degree temperature rise has already occurred, and it might rise to 1.5 as early as 2030. If you look at the risks, 1.5 degrees centigrade rise, even with a 1.5-degree rise, the risk of climate change rises. But compared to 2 degrees, a 1.5-degree centigrade rise is less of a risk, clearly. And WRI's, IPCC's report, and WRI sorted the issues, and I have put together both of this to come out with this chart. The people who suffer from heat wave, between 1.5 and 2 degrees, the risk difference is 2.6-fold. And if we look at the rest, food and ecosystem, in a certain sense, our lives and our health and our food, the important resources are impacted, and there's a difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, and that's clear. Backtracking a bit, the 1.5 degrees, if we are to contain to only 1.5 degrees rise, what level of effort is required in 2050 to bring emission to net zero? We need a reduction of emission of this order. In the case of 2 degrees, 2075 is when net emission should be down to zero. So we need to speed up the process. So for this purpose, various sectors must work on reducing emission, and policies must be introduced. And as Mr. Mizuno mentioned, how to create the necessary investment, how to secure the necessary investment for this. Respective countries submitted objectives objectives according to the Paris Agreement, if we roll this up, it does not amount to 1.5 degrees. It goes up even higher. So there are political challenges ahead, considering that this does not contain the temperature 1.5 degrees. The IPCC's 1.5 degree report talks about the central government's role and responsibilities. It talks about civil organizations and local governments and municipalities and the need for these entities to strengthen their capacity to achieve an ambitious goal. Amidst such circumstances, and when we look at the impact of global warming, IPCC's report, how should we interpret and receive that? Is it should we be in despair that there'll be no countermeasures, or should we be pessimistic even if we don't despair, or should we be optimistic? That was the discussion point. What do you think? I personally feel that these countermeasures in this scale and at this speed to be implemented is a major challenge indeed. That is how I feel. But at the same time, the existing technology that we have, by penetrating this kind of technology sufficiently, a considerable decrease is possible in terms of emissions. Recently, I don't go so far as to say optimistic, but there are two factors which causes us to be positive. The climate change countermeasures and the global warming countermeasures in the past are different from the present. The paradigm has changed because technology has changed, as Christiana mentioned. In the energy sector, technology has been innovated and it has penetrated and it has brought about the energy transition. Renewable energy cost has gone down, especially solar energy from 2017. In the 8 years following that one, the generation cost has been reduced to 1/4. So this kind of energy transition has created flows of a kind that we haven't seen in the past. A major transition is taking place. Bloomberg's power source mix is what this is. If we look at the actuals before the forecast, from 1970 for about 50 years, coal and oil and gas and the non-fossil fuels accounted for about the same share. From about 2010, however, the non-fossil fuels in the power sector has increased. The renewable energy cost reduction is one factor, which explained this to a great degree. But this is also promising from the standpoint of global warming. For example, India, in 2030, 20% of their power generation will be non-fossil fuel based, and that's the goal they have set forth for themselves. Kerry, an Indian research institute, will be putting out a report soon. Last year in November, Energy Ministry minister stated that in 2010, the goals will be achieved. They will therefore be fulfilling their objectives 10 years ahead. And as to whether India is doing this for global warming as a global warming countermeasure is a separate issue to be discussed. But energy transition is taking place, and reduction in emissions is actually taking place, and that is a fact. And as Mr. Mizuno explained earlier, long-term energy strategy roundtable as a backdrop to their discussion, is such that they're creating this as a growth strategy. In particular, renewable energy, a clean energy investment is an important point. And if you look at this, in 2017, 330 billion US dollars has been invested. This is the second in market history. A large market has been created. There's a potential for the creation of a large market when it comes to renewable energy. As for greenhouse gas reduction, energy transition has contributed largely. 213 was the peak. 2014, 15, and 16 economic growth was over 3%. But the energy sector CO2 emissions has not increased. And in Japan, renewable energy and energy efficiency improvement, as a result of that, 2013 as a peak, with 2013 as a peak, emission has been reduced. The same for employment. With energy transition, there is employment lost. At the same time, there is employment created.
In the renewable energy area, this is data from IRENA. In Japan, including large-scale hydro, 300,000 jobs was created in 2017. So, climate countermeasures. You work very hard to reduce emissions, but the actual picture is slightly different. It's not that people are having a difficult time. There's benefits from this. And a change in paradigm is that non-state actors will have a part to play. Municipalities, local governments. We will hear from the official from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government later on. For example, in the case of TMG, C40, this is a large city network. In addition to that, global covenant of mayors. 18 cities have participated in this. So this is a low-carbon decarbonization network amongst cities and local municipalities. We are starting to see these alliances. Companies are becoming more aggressive, more positive in this way. One example is the work on this science-based targets. Science-based targets, people from the business sector, I'm sure that I'm preaching to the converted, in the Paris Agreement, 2 degrees target, consistent with that, companies are to have such targets. And those companies that have such targets will be certified. Every time, the number of companies participating will increase. Right now, the number is up to 170 with certifications. In total, if you include ones that are preparing for this, the total number is 526. Amongst Japanese companies, Sumitomo Chemical, Mr. Kawamoto's company, Sumitomo Chemical is one such company. Japanese companies being certified. The number of such companies starting on this endeavor is increasing monthly. Science-based targets, SBTs. One feature about this is as for emissions from supply chains and value chains will also be covered. The Japanese government, until March 2020, 100 companies are to get certified. That's the support that the Japanese government is making. This is from Asahi Group. In 2050, net emission zero is the target. Scope 3. The purchases that you make, energy purchases, other than emissions, for example, raw materials, as for the consumers and users, after their consumption and the waste, value chain and supply chain emissions will also be covered in this target to reduce emissions throughout the value chain. I talked about Asahi Group because they have very specific program that will have an impact on suppliers. That was quite impressive. I will not delve deeper, but suppliers research is conducted and they have explanation sessions to suppliers, and whether the replies that were made are implemented or not, they check this. So they go to work on their suppliers in their supply chain. This is one such example. 2050, a major development toward 2050. This is by Kay Dunden, the announcement made in January. I think you should take a look at this. This is just some PR on my part. Their target for 2050, companies that have already targets For 2050, 67 such companies have already developed long-term vision. Some companies are represented in today's speakers. So 2050 vision, companies that have promised to do SBTs are included. They're very ambitious, net emission zero by 2050. Those are the companies that are included in this list. Now, why do we have this change in the business sector? Of course, they are doing this for CSR, corporate social responsibility. They are also doing this for branding purposes. I'm sure that there are many reasons. Or renewable energy or clean energy market is expected to grow. So they're probably looking at business opportunities in working on this. But the biggest impact has come from finance. As we heard from Mr. Mizuno earlier, I will only be brief because Mr. Mizuno has already discussed this, and I think we will hear from Mr. Kanai later on. Financial information disclosure for climate change risk, Sumitomo Chemical, GPIF. This is also approved by METI as well as Ministry of the Environment. Promising portfolios. For companies in a promising portfolio, you conduct engagement. This is Climate Action 100 Plus. GPIF has already approved this, and they are participating in this kind of endeavor to conduct engagement. Christiana talked about coal. In Japan, from last year, life insurance companies as well as financial institutions for new coal-fired plants, their credit policy has been made more stringent. More financial institutions are saying that they will be more stringent in their provision of credit to coal-fired plants. This is a major feature about finance. We will hear from Mitsui Trust later on to talk about this. Mr. Kanai will talk about this later on. 1.5 special report from IPCC. A large amount of reduction is still needed. That is what the report says. But it's not that it is hopeless. We don't want to be in despair. We don't want to be pessimistic. So lastly, I would like to talk about our long-term targets. I work with Mr. Mizuno, and my sense is that in that roundtable members, I'm sure that most of the people agree that Japan is working towards decarbonization, and Japan needs to show that through long-term goal to clearly indicate Japan's position towards decarbonization. I think we're in agreement that Japan needs to do so. For Japan to change, we need to clearly state the direction that Japan is headed, and we need to mobilize a lot of resources in that direction. And we need to send a signal that this is urgently needed. Specific, concrete goals. It has to be a concrete vision, a concrete goal that we need to show. The reason is, what is the challenge? What is the obstacle for Japan to change? We need to clearly indicate that and share that with many people, because if you don't do that, you cannot mobilize funds. Businesses in the private sector, they need to change their business policy, management policy, investment policy. When they are to change these policies, if the long-term vision is not concrete, it's not sufficient. to make businesses change their policies. So the government would need to show that clear long-term vision for businesses. And what I would like to expect is that it's not going to be just a vision. You need concrete measures. And the government will need to make a clear commitment to put into place such concrete measures. One example may be the treatment of coal. By clearly indicating what the measures will be, in this transformation, there could be winners and losers. But such social anxiety and social challenges must be dealt with against this vision. So in order to do that, you first need a clear vision, clear goals. Let me give you one example. By showing 2 degrees targets, with what kind of scale, what kind of change do we need to implement? That's one example of us knowing how much change we need. This is YEA's data. If we wanted to reach 2 degrees, then by 2050, 95% of power would have to come from low carbon sources. So that is kind of change we need. We're about to talk about 1.5 degrees, but this is around the world, which means Japan. If Japan is not able to convert 100% of power from low carbon sources, we would have a challenge to reach this target around the globe. At the 4th round meeting, this is my idea that was submitted to the 4th roundtable meeting held in December. I don't know how this will be dealt with, but I would say for Japan, for priority areas, we need clear goals and we need to have clear challenges and a clear direction in this long-term strategy. Lastly, this is global warming, climate change strategy that we're talking about. But as Prime Minister said, this is a growth strategy. Of course, we will be reducing emissions for climate change, but technical innovation, we are in the midst of unprecedented change. How industries, our economies, how innovation can be created in our economies. This is a strategy to create such innovation. We are having AI, automation, and digitalization, and energy transformation is also underway. But even without climate change, these major changes may be taking place. So in the midst of these changes, how do we deal with that change? If the other party is going to be on the offense, if you're just on the defense, rather than being on the offense, I want to write my own story. We want to write our own story in Japan. That is what we wish to do. So for this climate change strategy in Japan, for us, and for those people who are in the energy area, we have the technology in Japan in this renewable energy sector. We do have the capabilities here in Japan. So we want to be sending messages from Japan. In the midst of this transformation, we want to lead. That is the kind of long-term strategy that we wish to see from Japan. And with that, I would like to conclude my report. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Takamura. Non-state actors' developments in the world as well as in Japan, including data, were presented, and long-term strategy that Japan should be aiming at. We received a very strong message from Professor Takamura. Thank you so much.